What does it say about a person when they laugh at someone's voice, when they take something as natural as an accent and turn it into a weapon of humiliation? Have you ever been in a room where a simple comment cut deeper than any knife, where someone's dignity was stripped away because of the way they spoke? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you, and it may even change the way you see others. On a quiet Tuesday morning in New York City, inside a polished glass tower overlooking the skyline, a man named Richard Johnson was preparing for what he believed would be the most important day of his career. Richard was no ordinary man. He was a millionaire businessman, the kind who wore success like a perfectly tailored suit. Every detail of his life was calculated: his car, his watch, even the way he greeted his partners with a firm handshake that demanded respect. But behind that glossy exterior was something darker: arrogance. Richard believed wealth excused cruelty, that status justified superiority. And then there was Sarah Miller. She didn't own luxury cars or penthouses. She worked in Richard's home, cleaning rooms and setting tables, a job she carried out with quiet grace. Sarah wasn't born into privilege. She came from a small neighborhood on the outskirts of town, where her mother worked double shifts and every dollar mattered. Her accent carried the echo of those roots, soft, distinct, a reminder of the community that shaped her. Yet in Richard's eyes, that accent was a flaw, a reason to laugh. The morning seemed ordinary enough. Sarah moved quietly through the office lounge, arranging glasses of water and setting out fresh coffee for the high-profile meeting Richard was about to host. Investors were flying in from abroad, men whose approval could multiply Richard's fortune overnight. The air buzzed with anticipation, but as Sarah answered a simple question, her voice steady, her tone polite, Richard turned toward her with a smirk. "Say that again," he chuckled loud enough for everyone to hear. "That accent of yours. It makes you sound like you don't belong in a place like this." The room shifted. A few nervous laughs followed, not because it was funny, but because power often forces people to laugh even when they don't want to. Sarah lowered her gaze, her cheeks warming, but she didn't speak back. She simply nodded, as if she had learned long ago that silence was safer. Have you ever been in her shoes? Watching someone diminish you in front of others, knowing that your worth was so much greater than what they saw? What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the very thing he mocked would soon become the lifeline he desperately needed. Because hidden inside Sarah's quiet world was a gift that had nothing to do with wealth or privilege, but everything to do with resilience, discipline, and a past he had never cared to understand. The clock ticked toward noon, and the meeting room filled with tension. Richard adjusted his tie, rehearsing the lines he thought would win over the foreign investors waiting downstairs. To him, this was about money, prestige, another headline proving he was a man of influence. But life has a way of humbling even the proudest among us. What you're about to see unfold is more than a business deal. It's a story of contrast, between arrogance and humility, between cruelty and kindness, between a millionaire blinded by pride and a maid whose quiet strength would echo louder than any insult. And as their worlds collide in a way no one expected, you'll witness how a single voice, once ridiculed, can carry the power to change everything. Because in just a moment, when those investors step through the door, Richard Johnson will learn that his wealth can't save him, and Sarah Miller's accent, the one he mocked, will. Stay with me. The turning point is about to begin. Have you noticed how moments like this cut deeper than we expect? A single insult, a careless laugh, can stay with someone far longer than the person who spoke it will ever realize. Maybe you've been in a situation where someone dismissed you because of the way you spoke, the clothes you wore, or simply because you didn't fit into their idea of belonging. If that struck a chord with you, share it in the comments. I'd love to know your story, and your words might give strength to someone else reading them. And while you're here, if this kind of story resonates with you, If you believe we need more reminders of humility, respect, and the quiet power hidden in ordinary people, tap the like button. It may feel small, but it tells me that these stories matter to you, and it helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. If you're new here and you want to keep walking with me through these emotional, real-life inspired dramas, consider subscribing. Every time you join in, you become part of a community that values empathy over arrogance, kindness over cruelty, and lessons that go beyond wealth or status. Your voice, your presence here is what keeps this space alive. So don't just watch, be part of it. Because as Richard Johnson is about to discover, even the quietest voice can change everything. And in the next moment, you'll see exactly how. Richard Johnson's life was built on appearances. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was the picture of success, the kind of man who seemed untouchable, always in control, always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. His mornings began not with the sound of an alarm clock, but with the quiet hum of a personal assistant arranging his schedule. His breakfast wasn't hurried. It was served on fine china at a marble countertop, with imported coffee beans flown in from Colombia and croissants from a boutique bakery 2 blocks from Central Park. His penthouse windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view that reminded him every morning that he stood above the city, literally and figuratively. He often told himself that money wasn't just comfort, it was armor. When you have enough, people can't touch you, he'd say, adjusting his tie in the mirror before heading out to the office. Respect comes with the right suit, the right car, the right watch. He believed it down to his core. The Bentley parked downstairs was more than transportation. It was a statement, a rolling declaration that he had arrived at a place in life most only dreamed about. His office occupied the top floor of a sleek skyscraper, with dark wood, leather chairs, and art pieces that screamed wealth more than taste. Employees avoided direct eye contact, not because he demanded it, but because his energy filled the room like a weight pressing down on everyone around him. Richard didn't need to raise his voice. The silent message was clear. He was the one in charge, and no one questioned him. He loved the ritual of business meetings, the polished table, the neatly lined documents, the way people leaned in whenever he spoke. It was theater to him, a stage where he was the leading actor, his performance measured in deals closed and contracts signed. The numbers mattered, yes, but more than that, it was about dominance, about walking away knowing he had bent others to his will. And yet, behind the carefully constructed image, there was a man terrified of being seen as ordinary. Richard had built his empire on the belief that control and appearances shielded him from weakness. Humility, in his mind, was not a virtue but a liability. He avoided it at all costs. To him, every interaction was a performance, every gesture part of a script where he played the untouchable millionaire. That morning was no different. He walked through the office with the confidence of someone who knew others were watching. His designer suit fit perfectly, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Even the scent he wore was deliberate, a cologne chosen not because he liked it, but because it projected power, a subtle message to anyone who came too close. In the break room he paused, watching Sarah Miller set up the refreshments for the investors who were due to arrive. She moved with quiet precision, arranging the glasses just so, making sure the coffee was steaming, the napkins folded neatly. Richard noticed, but not with appreciation. To him, her presence was part of the background, like the furniture, useful but unremarkable. "Careful with those glasses," he remarked, his tone laced with superiority. "These people are important. We can't have anything looking cheap." Sarah nodded politely, keeping her focus on the task. "Yes, Mr. Johnson," she replied softly, her voice carrying that trace of her neighborhood accent that he had mocked before. He smirked, not missing the chance to let his arrogance spill into the air. "There it is again, that accent of yours. Sometimes I wonder if you even know how it sounds." The words cut sharper than he realized. But Richard didn't notice or didn't care. To him, it was a joke, a reminder of the gap between his world and hers. What he didn't see was the way Sarah straightened her back ever so slightly, swallowing the sting with the grace of someone used to enduring. Richard thrived on contrasts like this. In his world, people were divided into categories, those who mattered and those who didn't. Investors, partners, high net worth acquaintances, they mattered. Maids, drivers, receptionists, they didn't. This division gave him clarity, or so he thought. But what he couldn't understand was that life has a way of blurring those lines when you least expect it. There was something almost ritualistic about the way Richard prepared for the meeting that day. He rehearsed lines in his head, imagining the nods of approval from the investors, picturing the articles that would later highlight his brilliance in securing the deal. He loved the thought of headlines. Johnson expands empire with international partnership. For him, success wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, about making sure his name lingered in conversations long after he left the room. But legacy built on arrogance is fragile. He didn't know it yet, but his obsession with appearances, with the perfect image, was the very thing about to be tested. Because just beyond the doors of that conference room lay a truth he hadn't accounted for, that power doesn't always come dressed in a suit, and that sometimes the most influential voice in the room belongs to the one least expected. As he adjusted his cufflinks and glanced at his reflection in the polished glass, Richard muttered under his breath, "This is it. Today they'll see why I'm the man they need." He believed it wholeheartedly, and yet, just a few steps away, Sarah was finishing her work, unaware that her role in this story was about to shift. Her quiet presence, once invisible in his world of wealth and ego, would soon become the center of everything. Richard believed he had planned for every possibility, that nothing could surprise him. But the hidden truth about control is that it's an illusion. One unexpected word, one twist of circumstance, can unravel years of carefully built confidence. That was the reality waiting for him, and it was already closer than he imagined. The investors were on their way, their footsteps soon to echo in the marble hallway. The stage was set, the performance rehearsed, the millionaire ready to showcase his world. But beneath the polished surface, something was stirring, a subtle current of change, invisible yet undeniable, and when it finally broke through, Richard Johnson would discover that the most valuable asset in the room wasn't his wealth, his confidence, or his reputation. It was the voice he had chosen to dismiss. Sarah Miller's world could not have been more different from Richard Johnson's, yet it carried a richness he could never understand. Her mornings didn't begin with assistance or imported coffee. They began with the soft voice of her son, Ethan, calling from the small bedroom across the hall of their modest apartment. The walls were thin, the rent was high for what the place offered, but to Sarah it was home because it was theirs. The cracked tiles in the kitchen, the second-hand furniture, the squeaky old sofa, they all told a story of perseverance, of survival, stitched together one long shift at a time. She rose before dawn, quietly preparing Ethan's breakfast, making sure he had everything, ready for school. His backpack was always set near the door, filled with carefully sharpened pencils and second-hand books she had found at a community sale. He was only 8, but Sarah knew he had a bright mind, the kind of spark teachers often noticed. "You'll do big things one day," she would whisper as she kissed the top of his head before sending him off. He would smile and nod, not fully understanding the weight of her words, but feeling the warmth behind them. For Sarah, every extra hour she worked was not for luxury, but for opportunity. Her dream wasn't to wear diamonds or drive luxury cars. Her dream was Ethan's education, his chance at a life untouched by the struggles she had endured. That hope was what gave her strength when exhaustion crept in after a 14-hour day. It was what steadied her hands when others dismissed her with impatience. Behind her quiet demeanor lived a determination stronger than wealth, a kind of resilience that can only be born out of hardship. Sarah carried herself with humility, but it wasn't the humility of someone defeated. It was the humility of someone who understood the deeper value of life. She never raised her voice at work, never argued when spoken down to, even when Richard mocked her accent or treated her as if her presence was unworthy of the polished rooms she entered. Instead, she endured. She saved her voice for Ethan, for bedtime stories whispered under the dim light of their apartment lamp, for moments when she encouraged him to dream bigger than the world around them seemed to allow. "I know it's not easy, Mom," Ethan once said, his small voice breaking through the stillness of the night. "But I'll study hard. One day I'll buy you a house with a big yard, and you won't have to work so much." Her eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hide them with a gentle smile. "Sweetheart, you don't need to buy me anything. Just be kind, be strong, and never forget where you came from. That will be enough." What Sarah didn't realize was how much strength others could already see in her, even if she couldn't see it in herself. Her co-workers often noticed her calm under pressure, her ability to step in quietly when something went wrong and fix it without drawing attention. She never looked for recognition, but people remembered the way she carried burdens with grace. It was a hidden truth about her character. She didn't just endure life, she carried it with dignity. When she walked into Richard's world each day, she blended into the background, but that didn't mean she lacked presence. She had learned that real power often doesn't announce itself loudly. It grows quietly, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She knew her place in Richard's office wasn't glamorous. She wasn't there to impress investors or close deals. She was there to serve, to provide, to ensure her paycheck covered rent, utilities, and groceries. Yet beneath those simple tasks lay something unshakable, her refusal to let hardship define her spirit. Her accent, the one Richard mocked, wasn't a flaw. It was a reflection of her roots, of long nights spent listening to her grandmother's stories, of a community where neighbors shared what little they had, and where resilience was passed down like an heirloom. That accent carried history, identity, and strength. Richard heard weakness, but in truth, it was the sound of survival. The contrast between Sarah's modest apartment and Richard's penthouse was staggering. But so was the contrast between their values. Richard prized appearances, believing his reflection in the mirror was proof of his worth. Sarah valued impact, the small daily decisions that would shape her son's journey. She believed transformation didn't come from money, but from mindset, from the way a person chose to carry themselves when life demanded more than they thought they could give. Her life had taught her something Richard had never learned. Dignity isn't bought, it's lived. She didn't envy his skyscrapers or luxury cars because she knew they came with chains of their own, chains of pride, of fear, of an emptiness wealth couldn't fill. She had her own chains, yes, but they were the kind she could turn into fuel, the kind that pushed her forward. On that particular morning, as she set the glasses on the table in Richard's office, her thoughts were not on herself, but on Ethan. She pictured him at school, raising his hand, eager to answer questions. She imagined him in the future, walking across a stage to receive a diploma, smiling with the same determination she saw every day. That vision was her anchor. It was why she kept moving, why she chose silence over confrontation, why she endured insults that would have broken others. Still, even silence has its limits. There was a strength inside her that had not yet been revealed to Richard or anyone in his circle. A strength that had been shaped behind the scenes of her life, forged through years of sacrifice, late nights, and relentless effort. Sarah knew who she was. She didn't need Richard's validation, but what neither of them could predict was how quickly circumstances would bring her hidden truth to light, forcing everyone in the room to see her not as background, but as the center of the story. As the hour of the meeting approached, Sarah straightened the last glass, smoothing her apron with steady hands. Richard glanced at her briefly, offering no acknowledgement beyond a dismissive look, but the wheels of fate were already turning. aligning her journey with his in a way neither could escape. And while Richard believed the stage was his alone, Sarah's quiet resilience was about to step into the spotlight, transforming not only his perception of her, but the entire trajectory of the day. The conference room felt like a stage dressed in glass and steel, a place where confidence put on a suit and called itself certainty. Sunlight spilled across the long, polished table, and the city's skyline framed the moment like a backdrop chosen to impress. Assistants slipped in and out with quiet efficiency, placing folders at each seat, adjusting chairs by an inch, as if those little details could sway international investors. It was the kind of morning Richard Johnson lived for, the choreography of business, the performance of power. He took his spot at the head of the table, with the air of someone who believed the room belonged to him, because in his mind, rooms always did. Sarah entered with a tray, steady hands balancing water glasses and porcelain cups. Her posture was careful but natural, the practiced rhythm of someone who had poured 1,000 drinks without spilling a drop. She moved soundlessly from seat to seat, offering a small nod to each guest, her voice barely above a whisper. "Coffee or tea?" she asked a grey-haired executive near the door. "Water for now," he murmured without looking up. The tray never wavered. Richard swept the room with his gaze, catching the subtle glance of a junior analyst and holding it just long enough to remind everyone who carried authority here. He leaned toward the nearest investor, speaking in low tones about synergy, growth, momentum, the language of deals. But his attention flickered when he heard Sarah's voice at the far end of the table. It wasn't loud, it wasn't disruptive. It was simply there, carrying the familiar cadence he had mocked in private. His mouth curved into a thin smile that pretended to be casual. "Sarah," he said, raising his voice just enough for the room to hear, "make sure you set the cups on the right side, not the left. Our guests expect things a certain way." "Yes, Mr. Johnson," she replied, keeping her eyes on the cups as she placed them precisely where he wanted. He waited a beat. "Say that again?" She paused, unsure if he hadn't heard or if he was asking for something else. "Yes, Mr. Johnson." "There it is," he said, the smile sharpening. "That accent, it has a way of turning simple instructions into, well, something else, doesn't it?" A thin laugh escaped someone near the window, quick, nervous, and instantly regretted. A few others followed, the kind of uncomfortable chorus people join when they're not sure if silence is safer. Sarah's hand tightened on the tray for a fraction of a second. She lowered her eyes, not because she felt smaller, but because she understood that some moments were traps, and dignity is sometimes guarded by restraint. "I'm only pointing it out," Richard continued, as if he were doing her a favor. "In this line of work, clarity matters. We're hosting an important meeting. Presentation is everything." "Understood," Sarah said, her voice even, the slightest tremor hidden under discipline. He tilted his head, savoring the attention. "Maybe try it again." "Understood, sir. A little cleaner, just so we're all on the same page." "Understood, sir," she repeated quietly. The room shifted with the weight of it. That kind of spectacle leaves prints. You can't see, on the table, on the air, on the feeling of the day. The investors exchanged glances they pretended not to exchange. The junior analyst stared at his notes with fierce concentration, the words blurring. Someone coughed, and the sound rang too loud. You could feel the impact ripple out in small waves, respect cracking in a place where it mattered most, a power move framed as a joke that didn't land. This is what public humiliation looks like in polished rooms, not a shout, not a thrown glass, but a slow, smiling cut delivered under the halo of professionalism. It hides behind phrases like presentation, clarity, standards. It pretends to be feedback when really it's theater. And in that theater, Sarah stood in the wings, absorbing what the scene demanded of her. She breathed in steady. The tray stayed level. Her eyes went low, but calm remained. "I'll bring fresh coffee," she said gently, stepping away. "Let's make sure the cups match this time," Richard added, almost lazily. "We don't want anything to look out of place." "They do match," she answered, still soft. We ran short of the gold-rimmed set, so I used the white porcelain for the side table. He let out a quiet laugh. See? That difference right there. Details. It's the kind of thing people notice. A man at the end of the table forced a smile that didn't last. It's fine, he said, a little too quickly. Really? Richard shrugged with mock generosity. Of course it's fine. We're adaptable. But why? Not aim for perfect when we can? He looked back at Sarah, measuring her expression for any sign of defiance. There wasn't any. Only the calm of a person who had endured enough to understand that certain decisions, like whether to respond, carry consequences. Her mindset in moments like this was simple. Protect your peace. Protect your purpose. She disappeared behind the door to the service corridor, the sound of it closing like a hush settling over the room. Behind the scenes, she set the tray. Down on stainless steel, took a breath, and counted to 4 the way she'd taught Ethan to do when frustration built in his chest. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. She wasn't ashamed of her voice. She was tired of a world that pretended some voices deserved microphones while others deserved walls. It's okay, she whispered to herself. Focus. Do the work. In the conference room, the performance resumed. Richard launched into his opening remarks with a charm calibrated to impress. He talked about strategy, innovation, market share, the kind of revelations investors love to hear when numbers line up in their favor. Yet something faint and intangible had shifted. Respect is like fine crystal. It gleams in the light, but it cracks easily under pressure. A few of the guests looked at him differently now, not openly, not enough for him to notice, but the crack had started its quiet journey beneath the surface. Sarah returned with the refreshed tray. The porcelain cups, not gold-rimmed, gleamed as if to make a point. She moved carefully, placing each cup on its saucer, setting the sugar bowl exactly where fingers would reach naturally. She didn't rush. She didn't shrink. Her calm wasn't surrender. It was a decision, a refusal to give the scene more power than it deserved. Careful, Richard said again, feigning concern as she passed by his chair. We don't want any accidents. She met his gaze for one heartbeat, a look without challenge, only clarity. There won't be any, she said. Good, he replied, and leaned back as if he'd secured some small victory. The laughter that followed was thinner this time, a ghost of the first. People sense when a moment crosses a line even if they don't name it. They feel the wrongness coil in the room, and they adjust their posture, their smiles, their willingness to join in. Public humiliation has an immediate audience, but it never truly wins them over. It collects attention, yes, but not loyalty, not trust. Sarah finished her circuit and stepped back toward the wall, ready to assist if needed, invisible according to the script the world wrote for her. But invisibility is a misunderstanding. It assumes nothing is happening where eyes aren't. Her journey had been built in places like these, the quiet corners where character forms without applause. The hidden truth of her life, what had given her voice its steady core, was resilience layered over years, 1,000 small victories no one saw. She had learned another language after Ethan fell asleep at night, whispering vocabulary to herself under a thrift store lamp. She had sat through community college classes on weekends, circling words in battered textbooks. She had listened, really listened, to people, to the rhythms of speech, to the meanings behind words. That was her behind-the-scenes training, the part of the story no one asked about. At the head of the table, Richard lifted a glass of water and turned it slowly in his hand. He loved the optics of control, the impact of small gestures. Gentlemen, he said with a practiced smile, what we're offering is not just a partnership, it's acceleration, the right decisions, the right timing, the right execution. That's our advantage. He nodded toward the door, and as you can see, we run a tight ship. A guest softened his tone, careful now. It's clear you care about order. We do, Richard said. He tapped the folder in front of him. We care about excellence. From the wall, Sarah watched the room breathe as the conversation shifted toward numbers and projections. She had done her part, as she always did, and she would continue to do it because the job mattered. It paid for rent, groceries, soccer cleats Ethan had outgrown in a single season. She adjusted a cup that didn't need adjusting, the small habit that kept her centered. Then she felt the subtle nudge of a thought that had accompanied her for years. Dignity is a private promise you make to yourself. She recalled a memory like a touch on the shoulder, her grandmother's voice on a summer porch, telling her that respect isn't the opinion of the loudest person in the room. It's the way you carry your own name when no one else is protecting it. People will try to write your story for you, her grandmother had said. Child, pick up the pen. Ms. Miller, an investor said gently, surprising the room by addressing her. Could I trouble you for a slice of lemon if you have it? Of course, she said, grateful. For the change in air. Richard waved a hand with a thin smile. We can manage without the lemons, surely. Let's stay focused on the agenda. It's no trouble, Sarah replied, her tone intact. I'll bring it right in. She moved toward the door, and the silence she left behind wasn't empty. It held the echo of a decision, calm over conflict, steadiness over spectacle. That mindset didn't make her passive, it made her precise. In a world that rewarded noise, she chose clarity. When she returned, setting the small dish beside the investor's glass, a quiet thank you passed between them. No one else commented, but the gesture stuck to the edges of the room, a reminder that respect can enter softly and still have weight. Richard glanced at the clock, impatient for the moment he could dominate the conversation again. Control was his comfort, and the interruptions, no matter how small, felt like someone tapping at the frame of his portrait. He cleared his throat, recentering the agenda. Let's proceed to projections, he said. There's a growth curve here that speaks for itself. He slid a chart across the table as if handing over proof of destiny. And still, beneath the numbers, the day carried a quiet pivot. Moments like these seem small, but they live in memory. The first conflict had happened, public, undeniable, wrapped in the language of standards, and the room had recorded it. Not in minutes, not in transcripts, but in the subtle shift of how people saw him and how they saw her. Humiliation had tried to write the moment's headline. What it wrote instead was a question mark. Sarah stepped back to the wall again, hands folded lightly, a presence that didn't need permission. She wasn't thinking about winning. She was thinking about finishing the day, picking up Ethan from after-school care, cooking dinner with whatever she could stretch from the pantry, checking his homework, and, if she still had the energy, reviewing notes she kept tucked away in a worn notebook. Words, expressions, phrases she practiced late at night, not for show, but for the journey she had promised herself she'd continue. At the head of the table, Richard felt the meeting sliding into rhythm, confident again, unaware that the story had collected more than numbers. The glass tower held its breath, the city moved beneath it, and the door to the corridor through which the investor's next question would soon arrive, waited with the patience of things that change everything when they open. The tension in the room had settled into a rhythm that seemed predictable. Richard was back in control, at least in his own mind, guiding the investors through slides and charts with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. He had rehearsed every detail, every inflection of his voice, and every pause designed to emphasize his authority. The performance was seamless on the surface, but what he didn't realize was that beneath that polished veneer, tiny cracks were beginning to show. The human mind is sharper than people think. Guests remembered the way Sarah had been singled out, the awkward laughter that had followed, the slight discomfort that had hung in the air like a shadow no spotlight could chase away. Numbers filled the room. Percentages, forecasts, projected profits, and the investors leaned forward, some intrigued, others skeptical. Richard thrived on that skepticism. To him, doubt was nothing but an obstacle to crush, another chance to prove his superiority. His words carried the weight of certainty. This partnership positions us ahead of the curve, gentlemen. The timing is perfect, and the momentum is on our side." Yet, even as he spoke, Sarah moved quietly along the edges of the room, refilling glasses and adjusting small details no one asked her to fix. She wasn't part of the conversation, but her presence lingered like a counterbalance, an unspoken reminder that not everything in this room was about numbers or authority. She had returned with a calm determination, her movements steady, her gaze clear, as though the humiliation she had endured earlier had left no scar. That, in itself, was powerful, an act of resilience that needed no announcement. The investors noticed. Human nature leans toward empathy when someone is wronged, and while no one voiced it aloud, a subtle shift had taken place. Richard's arrogance had drawn attention, but Sarah's quiet strength held it. This was the hidden truth about influence. Sometimes the loudest voice is not the one people remember. Sometimes it's the one that endures without breaking. Richard pressed forward, showcasing his strategies for global expansion. He leaned heavily on visuals, flashing slides with graphs climbing upward like mountain peaks. "We're not just talking about growth," he said with a deliberate pause. "We're talking about transformation, a complete reshaping of the market, and with your partnership, that transformation is inevitable." The word transformation echoed in the room, carrying weight in ways he didn't intend. For Richard, it meant power, money, legacy. For others, it suggested something deeper, a shift not in markets, but in people, in values, in the way lives can change through choices and resilience. Sarah, standing quietly near the door, understood transformation differently. To her, it wasn't about wealth, it was about mindset, about the daily decisions to keep going when life stacked obstacles against you. One of the investors raised a question, his tone cautious. "Mr. Johnson, international ventures require more than numbers. There's cultural nuance, communication barriers, different expectations. How do you intend to bridge those gaps?" Richard smiled, almost smugly, as if the question were too simple. "We adapt. Business is a universal language. Once you demonstrate success, everything else follows." The answer was polished, but shallow. The investor tilted his head slightly, unconvinced. Another leaned back, folding his hands, waiting. Beneath the surface of the conversation, doubts began to swirl like currents in deep water, and then, almost unnoticed at first, the sound of foreign voices filtered in from the hallway. A soft murmur of conversation, distinct and unfamiliar, growing closer with every step. The true guests of honor, the international partners whose approval would make or break the deal, were about to enter. Richard straightened in his chair, tugging at his cufflinks, the performance inside him tightening for its final act. "Gentlemen," he said confidently, "our partners have arrived. You'll see firsthand why this deal is already a success." The door opened, and 3 men walked in, their expressions serious but courteous. Their attire was impeccable, but what stood out most was the cadence of their words as they greeted the room, not in English, but in their native language. Their tone was warm, polite, yet firm. The investors around the table exchanged quick glances. Richard rose to his feet, smiling broadly. "Welcome," he said, extending his hand. "We are honored by your presence." The men smiled politely, but responded in their own language, a string of sentences that rolled together with precision. Richard's smile stiffened. He glanced toward his team, searching for recognition, but none came. The language barrier had risen like a wall, and the rehearsed performance he had built so carefully began to crumble against it. He cleared his throat. "Of course, we'll find a way to communicate. Clearly, numbers are numbers after all." He gave a small laugh, hoping confidence alone could bridge the gap. But the men continued, gesturing to charts and documents, speaking with intent, their words filled with meaning no one in the room seemed able to grasp. The hidden truth was laid bare. Richard had planned every detail except the most crucial one. He had prepared for optics, for power, for control, but not for understanding. And now, the weight of that decision pressed down on him as Silence spread across the room. Sarah stood in the corner, watching. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm. She had heard those words before, late at night, while studying under the soft glow of her apartment lamp, whispering translations to herself, while Ethan slept in the next room. She had practiced endlessly, stumbling and correcting, determined to master what others had said was too difficult. Now, in this unexpected moment, all that hidden effort surfaced like a wave, ready to break. Richard tried again, gesturing to his slides. "We believe growth is universal," he said, his tone loud, as though volume might make up for comprehension. But the foreign partners exchanged looks, their polite smiles fading into confusion. The investors shifted in their seats, sensing the unraveling. Sarah exhaled quietly, the kind of breath you take before stepping into a place you never imagined yourself standing. She didn't move yet, but the decision was already forming inside her, a decision that would transform not just the meeting, but the entire dynamic of power in that room. Richard, oblivious, pressed forward, filling the silence with words that reached no one. "What matters most is trust," he declared, his voice echoing across the table. But the very trust he needed was slipping further out of reach with every second. The room was at the edge of revelation, balanced between arrogance and humility, between a deal saved and a deal lost. And at the quietest corner of it all stood Sarah Miller, the woman whose voice had been mocked, whose presence had been dismissed, and whose strength, unseen until now, was about to become the very thing that carried the meeting forward. The moment the investors stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but those attuned to energy could feel it, the kind of shift that carries weight, the kind that decides outcomes. 3 men, impeccably dressed in dark suits, entered with quiet confidence, their presence commanding attention without a single word of English. They greeted the room in their native language, voices fluid and precise, filled with tones most in the room couldn't decipher. Richard Johnson rose immediately, flashing the broad smile he reserved for photographs and headlines. His handshake was firm, his posture sharp, as though every inch of his body rehearsed dominance. "Welcome," he said, his voice full of pride. "We're honored to have you here today. This partnership will be groundbreaking." The investors listened politely, nodded once, and responded in their language. The words rolled together with clarity, but they fell into the air unanswered. The room grew still. Richard's expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he masked it with another smile. "Of course," he said, louder this time, as though volume could bridge comprehension. "We'll find common ground. Numbers are universal." But numbers weren't enough. The investors gestured toward the charts on the table, asking questions no one understood. Their brows furrowed, their tone sharpened slightly. They weren't being hostile, but they were precise men, and precision demanded clarity. Without it, trust slipped through cracks too small to see, but too wide to fix with charm. Richard chuckled awkwardly, turning to his team. "We expected this, gentlemen. They know what we're offering." He tapped the charts with the back of his pen. "Growth, acceleration, transformation. It speaks for itself." But it didn't. The investors exchanged another glance, their conversations spilling back and forth in words Richard couldn't catch. Their voices lowered, then rose again, punctuated with hand gestures toward the numbers, toward the charts, toward the opportunity they couldn't fully grasp. The deal, which had seemed inevitable, now hung in the air like a coin spinning on its edge, ready to fall one way or the other. Sarah stood near the door, her hands folded neatly, watching it all unfold. To most in the room, she was invisible, part of the furniture, her presence acknowledged only when drinks needed refilling. But inside her, the words of the investors weren't foreign at all. They were familiar, like old friends returning. She caught their meaning clearly, every phrase fitting into the hours she had spent at night, whispering vocabulary to herself, repeating sentences until they stuck. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath shallow, not because she couldn't understand, but Because she could. Richard tried again, this time spreading his arms in a wide gesture. Trust me, gentlemen, success needs no translation. Success is universal. The statement landed poorly. One of the investors leaned forward, his expression tightening. He spoke slowly, enunciating as though trying to make himself understood. Still, his words fell into silence. Richard glanced at his assistants, at the investors seated around the table, searching for anyone who could rescue him from the weight of his own unpreparedness. But no one moved. His confidence cracked further, though he fought desperately to keep it intact. For a man who had built his identity on control, the loss of it was unbearable. His smile turned rigid, his shoulders stiffened. The investors pressed on, their tone shifting from polite inquiry to frustration. The deal was slipping, not because the numbers were wrong, but because the bridge between them had never been built. Behind the polished surface of the meeting, the hidden truth revealed itself. Richard had never prepared for this. He had prepared for power, for optics, for dominance, but not for understanding. His entire mindset was built on the assumption that money erased barriers, that confidence was enough to override reality. But in this moment, the reality was unforgiving. "Gentlemen," he said again, his voice sharp now, betraying the cracks beneath. "Let's not get lost in details. The big picture here is opportunity." But the investors didn't need the big picture. They needed clarity, respect, the effort of someone willing to meet them where they were. And Richard wasn't capable of it. The room shifted further into discomfort. The investors leaning back, their expressions cooling. One scribbled something in a notebook, another shook his head slightly. Sarah's heart pounded. She had no intention of speaking, not yet, but she felt the tension thickening like fog. She could see it clearly. The opportunity was collapsing, sliding, away second by second, not because the offer lacked strength, but because the man leading it lacked humility. She felt the familiar pull between silence and action, between invisibility and revelation. And though she said nothing, the decision was forming inside her like the tightening of a thread. Richard tapped the table with his pen, desperate to reclaim control. "This is what partnership looks like," he insisted. "Decisiveness, vision, results." His words echoed in the room, but no one leaned closer to hear them. They felt hollow now, disconnected from the moment, from the need that had presented itself so clearly. The investors spoke again, this time more firmly, their sentences lined with urgency. Their tone wasn't angry, but it was clear. If they weren't understood, there could be no agreement. And with every word Richard failed to grasp, the ground beneath him weakened. This was the revelation he couldn't see. Power doesn't reside in appearances, but in connection. And connection requires understanding, respect, and the humility to listen. The very things Richard had dismissed were now the only things that mattered. Sarah adjusted the tray in her hands, steadying herself. She had carried her hidden knowledge like a secret for years, not because she was ashamed of it, but because the world never asked her to share. Yet here was the moment, the behind-the-scenes preparation, the late nights, the whispered practice, all converging into a chance that no one could have predicted. Richard's voice grew louder, almost defensive now. "The bottom line is clear. Profits will grow, and with them so will your influence. Isn't that what matters most?" But the silence that followed told the truth. The investors weren't swayed by numbers alone. They were men of precision, men who valued clarity over spectacle, men who needed to be heard before they could decide to listen. And Richard, for all his wealth and power, had failed to hear them. The deal was unraveling, thread by thread, and everyone in the room felt it. The assistants avoided eye contact. The analysts scribbled notes they wouldn't use. The air grew thick with unspoken doubt. Richard was still talking, still performing, but his words no longer reached anyone. At the far end of the room, Sarah's eyes lifted. She wasn't looking at Richard anymore. She was looking at the investors, meeting their gaze for the first time. And in that gaze, something passed between them. Recognition, possibility, The unspoken question of whether she would step forward. The meeting teetered on the edge of collapse. Richard didn't know it yet, but his moment of control was already gone. And standing quietly in the background, the woman he had mocked was preparing to reveal the strength he had never imagined she possessed. The air inside the conference room had grown so dense with tension that even the quietest breath seemed loud. Richard's words still spilled across the table, full of forced optimism, but they no longer had impact. His sentences, rehearsed and polished, fell flat against the silence of investors who could not understand him. The deal he had built his confidence around was dissolving in real time, slipping through his fingers like sand he couldn't hold on to. At the edge of the room, Sarah's hands trembled for a fraction of a second before steadying against the tray she carried. She had listened long enough to know the exact point where the silence had become unbearable. It wasn't her place to speak. She was the maid, the invisible presence expected to serve quietly and fade into the background. But something inside her shifted. She thought of Ethan, her son, the countless nights she had whispered foreign words to herself so he could sleep without worrying about the bills on the counter. She thought of her grandmother's voice telling her that silence is not always strength, that sometimes strength is choosing to be heard. Sarah inhaled slowly, then spoke. Her voice, gentle but clear, rolled into the room in the very language the investors had been using all along. Every syllable carried the weight of her practice, her determination, her resilience. The room froze. For a moment, no one moved. The tray she set on the side table clicked softly, the only sound breaking the stunned silence. Then one of the investors turned sharply, his eyes locking onto her with surprise that softened almost immediately into recognition. She had understood him perfectly. With calm precision, Sarah translated his question into English. "He is asking," she said evenly, "how you intend to adapt your model to local markets without understanding cultural expectations." Her accent, the very sound Richard had ridiculed hours earlier, now carried authority. It wasn't a weakness, it was strength, living proof of a hidden truth no one in the room had expected. Richard blinked, stunned. "You speak their language?" His words stumbled, uncharacteristically unsure. Sarah didn't look at him. Instead, she turned to the investors, her voice steady, and answered in their tongue. Her tone was warm, respectful, but confident, bridging the gap Richard had left gaping open. The investors leaned forward, relief spreading across their faces as clarity replaced confusion. They nodded, gestured, asked follow-up questions, and Sarah translated each one with grace, never faltering, never rushing. The transformation in the room was immediate. Where moments earlier tension had reigned, now connection took root. The investors smiled as they spoke, no longer forced but genuine, engaging fully in the dialogue that had been impossible without her. Their confidence in the conversation returned, and with it, the possibility of trust. Richard sat in his chair, speechless. For the first time in years, he wasn't the center of the performance. He wasn't leading the script. He was a spectator, forced to watch, as the maid he had mocked not only salvaged the meeting, but elevated it to a place he could never have reached on his own. "I can assure you," Sarah translated, her voice flowing seamlessly, "that the company is committed to respecting cultural nuance and adapting operations to meet the standards you require." The investors looked at one another and nodded approvingly. One of them even smiled directly at Sarah, offering a compliment in his language. "You speak beautifully. Thank you for helping us feel understood." Her cheeks warmed, but she met his eyes with quiet dignity. "It's my honor," she replied in his language, her pronunciation precise, her tone unshakably respectful. Richard shifted uncomfortably. His ego, which had always been shielded by wealth and power, now sat exposed in the raw light of humility. The accent he had dismissed as inferior had become the very key to unlocking the deal he needed most. He forced a laugh, trying to reclaim authority. "Well," he said, "I was just about to ask Sarah to step in." The words rang hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. This wasn't a planned intervention. This was a revelation, an unplanned, undeniable reminder that arrogance blinds while humility reveals. Sarah continued her work with flawless focus. She translated technical details, cultural concerns, and subtle expressions that could never be captured by numbers alone. She moved effortlessly between languages, her voice carrying not just words, but meaning, respect, and connection. As she spoke, the investors grew more animated, their tone lighter, their posture more open. They leaned into the discussion now, asking about specifics, clarifying agreements, and smiling in approval when Sarah conveyed Richard's answers with clarity he could never have provided. For the first time that day, the room no longer belonged to Richard's wealth or his confidence or his dominance. It belonged to Sarah, the woman who had walked in unseen, mocked, and underestimated, only to reveal the depth of her strength when it mattered most. Inside Richard's chest, humiliation burned hot. His empire, his performance, his carefully crafted image, all of it had been eclipsed in a matter of minutes by the one person he had treated as invisible. He tried to steady himself, tried to appear composed, but the truth was undeniable. Every eye in the room had shifted. Respect had been redirected, flowing towards Sarah in ways he could never control. And yet she didn't gloat. She didn't raise her chin in triumph or throw his cruelty back at him. Her humility remained intact. She wasn't there to humiliate him. She was there to serve the truth, to bring clarity, to build a bridge, to do the job that no one else in the room could. In her mind, she thought only of Ethan, of what this moment could mean for his future, of how her strength in this room would one day be part of the story she would tell him when he asked why she had never given up. Because, she would say, even when others doubted me, I carried the strength to choose differently. The dialogue between Sarah and the investors grew richer, deeper. She explained nuances of Richard's presentation that had been lost in translation, adjusted cultural references so they resonated properly, and answered small questions with precision that made the investors feel valued. They weren't just hearing words now, they were experiencing respect. Richard's hands tightened around his pen. He watched helplessly as his authority slipped further away, as the spotlight he had always demanded turned instead onto the maid he had dismissed. The irony was brutal. The very voice he had mocked was now the one carrying his success. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in the room felt the revelation. They saw the transformation happening before their eyes, the invisible becoming essential, the underestimated becoming irreplaceable. Sarah wasn't simply translating words. She was rewriting the story of the meeting, and with it, the perception of power in the room. The investors nodded. Once more, this time with visible satisfaction. Their voices, once sharp with frustration, now softened with approval. They leaned back in their chairs, their smiles genuine, their tone collaborative. The deal that had seemed to collapse only moments before was now alive again, saved, not by Richard's wealth or his arrogance, but by the quiet strength of the woman he had humiliated. And as Sarah finished another flawless translation, the room held its breath for a moment, acknowledging silently that everything had changed. The path forward was clear, the connection restored, and the deal once thought lost now stood stronger than ever. Yet beneath the surface, the greatest impact wasn't on the numbers or the contracts. It was on the man who sat at the head of the table, forced to confront the hidden truth he had ignored for far too long. The meeting pressed on, every word flowing through Sarah's voice, every revelation reshaping the balance of power. And though Richard struggled to keep his composure, he knew deep down that the turning point had already arrived, and nothing would be the same again. For Richard Johnson, humiliation didn't arrive like a slap. It arrived like a slow unthreading. One stitch at a time, the image he wore so confidently began to loosen, unraveling in places he couldn't hide with a smile or a sharper tone. It started in the eyes around the table, the investors, the analysts, even the assistants. shifting from him to Sarah as if the center of gravity in the room had moved. He felt it before he could name it, a tilt inside his chest, a falter in the rhythm that had always obeyed him. He tried to measure the moment like he measured everything else, posture straight, voice controlled, jaw set. But control is an illusion when the truth is standing right beside you, translating what you can't understand. Sarah's voice kept flowing, clear, unhurried, steady. The same accent he had mocked now shaped each sentence with precision, carrying intention. Instead of apology, she bridged questions to answers, concerns to solutions, and she did it without claiming space. The space simply formed around her. The investors leaned in as she spoke, not because she demanded attention, but because she earned trust. Trust is always the real currency. Richard had collected money. She was gathering belief. He watched her, trying to keep his face composed, and felt a heat climb his neck that no air conditioning could cool. Something inside him, made of pride and habit, kicked against the sensation. It whispered the old script, "You're the one in charge. You built this. She's just—" He didn't finish the sentence. The word "just" couldn't survive the moment. Even his inner defense sounded small, like a child insisting the sun hadn't actually risen because he preferred the dark. One of the investors set a palm on the papers and spoke softly to Sarah, his eyes warming. She answered with ease, then turned to English. "He appreciates the proposal," she said, "but wants to confirm 2 adjustments in the implementation timeline, specifically a phased approach to local compliance, quarterly review, not monthly, and a liaison who reports directly to their regional team." "Of course," Richard replied reflexively, then stumbled. "Naturally, I planned for flexibility." Sarah continued, translating both his intention and what he had failed to articulate. There was grace in it, almost protective, the way she cleaned up the edges of his words, without exposing the gaps. That was the hidden truth unfolding in real time. Her power didn't embarrass him, his ego did. She was doing what true professionals do, making the work work. He was the only one in the room still pretending performance could replace substance. He swallowed hard and looked at the window to avoid the eyes that now carried a different kind of reflection. New York stretched beyond the glass like a judge who never spoke, only watched. He saw a faint outline of himself, expensive suit, careful hair, expensive watch, floating over the city he loved to conquer, but the outline looked thin. He thought of the years he had built this identity, brick by brick, decision by decision, and how often those decisions had been made for the applause, not the impact. Transformation wasn't something he believed in unless it raised the market cap. Yet here it was, not on a chart, but at the end of the table, in the form of a woman he had considered part of the decor. "Mr. Johnson," one of the investors said carefully in accented English, "your presentation is strong, but this," he gestured to Sarah, "this makes the difference." Richard nodded too quickly. "We value diverse skill sets," he replied, and even he heard the hollowness of the line. The sentence landed like a brochure, all gloss and no weight. Another question arose in the investor's language, and Sarah stepped forward. "They're asking," she said, "if they can hold a brief breakout to address cultural adaptation during onboarding, internal scripts, customer support phrasing, small gestures that communicate respect in their markets." Richard forced a smile that felt like a suit one size too small. "We can accommodate." "Not accommodate," Sarah said gently, still translating for the investors as she turned. "Embed. They prefer that we embed it from the start." The distinction slid under his skin. Embed. Not paper over, not pretend. Embed. He recognized in that single word everything he'd ignored in his rush to appear inevitable. The room had already moved to a different mindset, one that didn't accept dominance as proof of competence. Connection was the new standard, and he hadn't studied. A strange memory surfaced, the first big deal he ever closed. He had been young, hungry, and terrified. Back then, fear had sharpened him. He listened more, he asked questions. He stayed up nights crafting proposals that answered the client's specific fears instead of dazzling them with his ambition. Somewhere along the journey, comfort replaced curiosity. Reputation replaced preparation. The revelation wasn't loud, but it was brutal. He hadn't outgrown humility. He'd abandoned it. Across the room, an analyst passed Sarah a pen. She annotated a clause on a printout, then explained it in the investor's language with the fluency of someone who had walked this terrain longer than anyone realized. "We can restructure this portion to reflect regional practices," she said. Then paused to be sure they were with her. Yes, exactly like that. She smiled, not triumphant, just present, and that made the smile land like light. Richard's fingers tightened on his pen until they ached. He began, then stopped. His throat felt dry. He wasn't used to silence when it came from him. He felt small, and the smallness wasn't humiliation alone. It was the accurate size of a man who had mistaken volume for value. The truth shrank him down to scale, and for a moment he hated it. Then, like a reluctant breath, something else entered. Relief. There was relief in the room finally having what it needed. There was relief in not pretending. He looked at Sarah fully for the first time. Not at her role, not at the uniform, not at the accent, but at her. She stood balanced in the moment, translating tension into clarity, vanity into progress. He noticed the steadiness in her hands, the way she paused to confirm understanding before moving on, the integrity of effort that came. From the behind-the-scenes work no one applauds. He realized he knew nothing about her. He knew the sound of his own voice far better than he knew the people who made his days possible. An investor spoke again, more animated now, and Sarah's reply carried a soft laugh in their language. The men smiled, the mood lifting from the brittle edge it had held. She turned to English. "They're proposing a pilot in 2 cities first, with shared oversight. If it succeeds, they want to expand to 4. "That's excellent," Richard said, meaning it but hearing himself. He didn't sound like a captain. He sounded like a passenger trying to keep balance in a ship he hadn't learned to steer in these waters. A pause arrived, light and fragile. He felt the urge to reclaim the room, to splint his pride with a casual joke, to pretend that all of this had been part of his plan. The habit was almost irresistible, but habit is a decision you forgot you were making. He realized that if he spoke to save face, he would erase what mattered. He would step on the bridge just as it reached the other side. He would turn connection back into performance. He set the urge down. Sarah glanced in his direction, not seeking permission, not asking for credit, simply checking whether he would support what needed to happen. It was the simplest of choices, and it revealed everything. He lifted his chin and gave a short nod. "Go ahead," he said quietly. 2 words, small but honest. They felt like the first true thing he'd offered all day. The discussion deepened. Logistics, timelines, risk mitigation, local hiring. Sarah threaded each question to an answer with patient care. When she needed specifics, she turned to Richard for numbers only he carried, and he provided them without theatrics. It was foreign territory for him, to contribute without commanding, to help without being seen helping. The impact was immediate. He felt the room shift again, this time toward collaboration instead of competition. He wasn't center stage, but the work was moving. That felt unexpectedly right. He replayed, uninvited, the moment he had mocked her accent, the laugh, the smirk, the way he'd asked her to repeat herself a little cleaner. Shame flared through him and left a flush he could not suppress. It wasn't an abstract embarrassment. It had a face, a voice, a consequence. He had used power to make himself feel taller. That is not leadership. That is insecurity with good tailoring. In a quieter pocket of dialogue, he leaned toward her, keeping his voice low. "Ms. Miller," he said, stumbling over the formality he had withheld, The apology stuck, not because it wasn't real, but because the words seemed small against the size of what was owed. She saved him from performing contrition. "We can clarify the compliance line if you want to propose quarterly audits," she said, neutral, offering him a productive path instead of a stage. It was a mercy disguised as logistics. He nodded, grateful in a way he didn't have a language for. The meeting moved with a new rhythm, unforced, balanced, efficient. Even the assistants breathed easier. The analysts leaned forward. The investors spoke in full paragraphs now, trusting that their meaning would survive the journey across tongues, because Sarah was carrying it. She had become both bridge and compass, and no one wanted to cross without her. In the lull before a final set of technical questions, Richard watched her jot a note and tuck a strand of hair behind her ear with the absent-minded grace of someone used to doing 5 things well at once. He tried the thought on. What if leadership meant insisting on the best translator in the room, even when the leader wasn't him? What if the mindset that built companies wasn't dominance, but the discipline to find the person who could do the thing you could not, and honor them for it? The realization swept through him with something like grief for the years he had spent mistaking loudness for strength. But grief is also a gateway, if you let it be. He felt the gateway open. One investor gestured toward the city through the glass, then back to the folder. "We believe," he said in his language, deliberate now, "that respect is the heart of partnership." He nodded to Sarah. "And today we have felt respected." She translated this last line without embellishment, and the room fell into a steady, affirming quiet. Richard didn't reach for the line, didn't try to stamp it with his initials. He let it stand where it belonged. A few minutes later, there came a sequence of practicalities, draft language, follow-up dates, a tentative outline for the pilot. None of it glittered, yet all of it carried weight. The deal hadn't closed, and nothing about the future was guaranteed, but possibility had replaced peril. That shift was the day's most honest metric. As chairs slid, as pens capped, as hands prepared to shake, Richard turned slightly toward Sarah. He found the words at last, not dressed for a ceremony, just carrying their own shoes. "Thank you," he said, quiet enough for only her to hear. "I was wrong." She held his gaze with an evenness that did not punish and did not console. "I'm here to do the work," she answered. Then, softer, and only because it mattered to the work, "We all are." He nodded, the admission settling into him like a key turning. A different kind of authority rose in the room, one that didn't announce itself, one that made space instead of taking it. He felt smaller than when the day began, and somehow more human. The fall didn't break him, it sized him. That was the revelation he hadn't known he needed. Around the table, the investors gathered their papers with a calm that suggested continuation. Questions remained, details needed refining, and the path would demand patience. Yet the tone had changed in a way everyone could feel. Sarah's notes sat neat beside her hand, a map of the ground they had actually covered, not the one he had imagined from the top of the skyline. He glanced at the window again, and the city no longer looked like a mirror. It looked like a place to learn. In the corridor beyond the glass doors, footsteps approached with the soft inevitability of the next thing that always follows the last. The meeting hadn't ended, it had opened. The room breathed, and the day, now carrying the imprint of humility where arrogance had stood, was ready to move forward into the work that waited just outside. The meeting stretched into its final hour, but the energy in the room was no longer tense. It had transformed into something steady, constructive, alive with possibility. The investors leaned forward with pens in hand, drafting notes, marking adjustments, and nodding at one another with visible satisfaction. The deal, which had seemed destined to collapse, was breathing again, and everyone knew the reason. It wasn't the graphs Richard had rehearsed, nor the polished phrases he had crafted for impact. It was Sarah, her voice, her patience, her ability to translate not just words, but meaning. She had turned confusion into clarity, frustration into progress. The hidden truth had become impossible to ignore. She wasn't a background presence anymore. She was the hinge on which the entire negotiation turned. Richard sat quietly for once, the weight of that realization pressing against his chest. He had built his identity on being the man who saved the room, the one whose presence commanded attention and dictated outcomes. But today he wasn't the savior. He wasn't even the one in control. And strangely, the room didn't fall apart without him at the center. It thrived. The investors spoke again, their language now flowing back and forth with Sarah's effortless rhythm. She relayed each concern, adjusted details, and explained nuances until all sides reached understanding. One of the men leaned back in his chair at last, smiling broadly. "We are ready," he said in his native tongue, his voice warm, decisive. "We will move forward." Sarah translated the words into English, her tone calm but carrying the weight of finality. "They've agreed to the terms. The partnership is confirmed." The announcement landed with quiet thunder. For a moment, no one spoke. Then pens clicked, hands extended, and relief rippled across the table. The investors signed the preliminary documents with firm strokes of their pens, sealing what only an hour earlier had been on the brink of collapse. Richard rose to his feet automatically, shaking hands with practiced ease. "This is excellent news," he said, his voice firm but softer than usual, as though the old edge of arrogance had been blunted. He looked at Sarah briefly, then back at the investors. "We are honored to begin this journey together." But even as the room celebrated, everyone knew the story behind the signatures. The numbers might have attracted the deal, but the respect Sarah had given the investors had secured it. Richard lingered after the formalities, watching as Sarah collected her notes, carefully setting the signed documents in order. The others were already standing, preparing to leave, their voices a mix of English and foreign phrases. He stayed rooted, feeling the strange burn of humility in his chest. "Ms. Miller," he said finally, his tone quieter than it had been all day, "I owe you more than I can express." Sarah looked up, steady but not self-satisfied. "I only did what needed to be done." "No," Richard said, shaking his head slowly. "You did far more than that. You saved this deal. You gave us something I couldn't." His words stumbled, but the sincerity behind them was undeniable. "And I was wrong about you, about everything." She didn't rush to answer. Her silence wasn't sharp, it was dignified, the kind that lets truth sink deeper. Finally she replied, "It's not about me, Mr. Johnson. It's about respect. People deserve it, whether they're sitting at the table or serving it." The words struck him harder than any insult could have. Respect. The word sounded simple, but it carried the weight of every moment he had dismissed her, every careless comment, every laugh at her expense. The revelation was uncomfortably clear. He had treated her as invisible when she had been indispensable all along. "I see that now," Richard admitted, his voice lower, "and I will not forget it." The investors approached Sarah as they left, shaking her hand with genuine gratitude. One of them said, warmly in his language, "Without you, none of this would have happened." She answered in kind, her fluency flowing like water. Their smiles were the proof of connection, the kind of connection money alone could never buy. Richard stood by, watching the exchange. He realized that the room didn't look at her as the maid anymore. They saw her as the professional who had salvaged the deal, the bridge that had turned division into partnership. And for the first time, he understood the impact of humility, of recognizing value, where he had once only seen weakness. As the last investor departed, Richard lingered near the table. He glanced at Sarah, still tidying the documents with the same quiet grace she had shown all morning. But now, the silence between them felt different. Not the silence of superiority, but the silence of acknowledgement. "You deserve more," he said finally. "More than the way I've treated you, more than the way I've seen you. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to make things right." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "What matters," she said softly, "is that Ethan has a future. That's why I work." The mention of her son hit him like a chord he hadn't known was missing. Behind the scenes, she carried not just herself, but someone else's dreams, someone else's chance at transformation. He realized then that her strength wasn't just skill, it was sacrifice. It was the countless hidden hours she had poured into learning, the mindset, that kept her moving forward when the world told her to stay in her place. He exhaled slowly. Then maybe it's time I start seeing the people around me not for the roles I assign them, but for the lives they actually live. Sarah didn't smile, but her eyes softened just slightly. She gathered her tray, balanced it carefully, and said, "Respect is the first step. Everything else follows." As she left the room, the sound of her footsteps echoed not like background noise but like punctuation at the end of a revelation. Richard remained by the window, the city sprawling beyond him. But for once, he didn't see the skyline as his stage. He saw it as a reminder of choices, of consequences, of the hidden truths that sit quietly in the people we overlook. The deal had closed. Success was his. But the victory no longer felt like his alone. It was Sarah's too, more hers than his if he were honest. And as he stood in the silence, humbled but strangely lighter, he knew his journey had shifted. Power no longer looked like dominance, it looked like respect. And just outside the room, Sarah walked with her head high, not as the maid who had been mocked, but as the woman who had saved the future of an empire with nothing more than her voice and her dignity. The story was no longer about wealth versus poverty. It was about transformation, about a man who learned humility and a woman who proved that true value doesn't need permission to be seen. The corridor ahead was bright with afternoon light, and though the day wasn't over, something irreversible had already begun. The deal was only the beginning. The real impact was still unfolding, carried quietly in the footsteps of a woman who had turned humiliation into redemption without ever raising her voice. The city outside the glass tower carried on, as if nothing had happened. Yellow cabs streamed along the avenues, people hurried across crosswalks with coffee cups in hand, and the hum of New York remained relentless, unbothered by what had unfolded several floors above. Yet for those who had sat inside that conference room, something invisible had shifted. The documents were signed, the deal was alive, but the deeper story wasn't written on paper, it was etched into memory. Richard lingered near the window long after the investors had gone. His reflection stared back at him, still clad in the suit and tie he wore like armor, but the armor no longer felt impenetrable. The memory of his own words replayed in his mind. Sharp, careless remarks aimed at Sarah, spoken without thought, delivered with arrogance. Each one echoed differently now, like old recordings that revealed truths you didn't hear the first time. He realized that those words had not only exposed her to humiliation, they had revealed his own blindness. Sarah's voice, once mocked, had become the anchor of the meeting. It was her language, her calm, her strength that had carried the room when his performance had collapsed. The irony was brutal, but it was also just. Emotional justice doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, through the steady rhythm of a voice that proves stronger than pride. Words have weight, Richard murmured to himself, though no one else was there to hear it. They can build, or they can break. He thought of the way Sarah had answered with dignity instead of anger, the way she had chosen clarity over confrontation even after he had tried to make her small. That choice had changed everything. It wasn't silence that gave her power. It was the decision to use her voice at the precise moment when it mattered most. Down the hall, Sarah walked with the same quiet grace she always carried, but now the air around her felt different. She wasn't invisible anymore. Those who had seen her in the room today would never see her the same way again. She wasn't simply the woman who set tables and carried trays. She was the woman who had saved an empire's deal with nothing more than preparation, patience, and courage. As she waited for the elevator, she thought briefly of Ethan. He was probably in after-school care, running across the gym floor, laughing with friends, maybe trying to beat his best time in a game of tag. One day, she would tell him about this meeting, not for the glory, but for the lesson. She wanted him to know that strength often hides in places the world overlooks, that resilience is a form of quiet power, and that dignity carries more weight than money ever could. When the doors opened, she stepped inside, her reflection in the mirrored panel, showing a woman who had not changed outwardly, but who carried the hidden truth of her own value more firmly than ever before. She pressed the button for the lobby, exhaled slowly, and let the hum of the elevator carry her downward. Back in the conference room, Richard turned away from the window at last. His world had shifted, though he wasn't yet sure how to live in this new shape. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of humility, not as a performance, but as a realignment. He had always believed that wealth insulated him from lessons, but today had taught him something different. Humility isn't weakness, and respect isn't optional. The room was empty now, but his mind was full. He remembered Sarah's words. Respect is the first step. Everything else follows. They stayed with him, repeating like a mantra he couldn't shake. The hidden power of this story wasn't just that Sarah had saved a deal. It was that she had revealed the impact of something far greater. Words. The words he had used to belittle had left scars, even if she never admitted them. And the words she had used to translate had healed what his pride had broken. Transformation, he realized, doesn't begin in contracts or bank accounts. It begins in language, in the way we choose to speak, the way we choose to see others, the way we choose to connect. To those watching this unfold, the lesson is undeniable. Never judge someone by their accent, their clothes, or their job. You never know which voice will become the one that saves you, the one that redefines the outcome, the one that shifts the entire journey. What appears small on the surface may carry the greatest impact beneath it. The behind-the-scenes resilience, the hidden preparation, the dignity carried quietly, all of it has the power to transform not only moments, but lives. And if you've made it this far into the story, maybe it's because this message resonated with you on a deeper level. Maybe you've felt the sting of being underestimated, or maybe you've realized uncomfortably that you once underestimated someone else. If this message was for you, let it be known. Leave your mark in the comments with words like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." Because this isn't just a story, it's a reflection of choices we all make. And the next chapter, the next voice, the next revelation is waiting just around the corner. There's another video right here that continues this journey, and I'd like you to step into it with me. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths, and that respect has the power to change everything. If you stayed with me until the very end, let me know in the comments. Write something simple like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I always enjoy seeing who connected deeply with the story. And if this kind of content speaks to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey we'll walk through together. A like also helps me understand that these reflections matter to you, and it makes a real difference in keeping this space alive. And now, if you're ready to keep going, there's a video right here that continues along the same thread. Click it, and let's move forward together.